So yeah, I'm happy to be here today and talk about our research on machine learning for education, or maybe more specifically about how we can build models of human knowledge and learning which can be accurate and generalizable and interpretable at the same time. But let me first take just one step back and talk about AI in general. So the recent advances in generative AI, or mainly large language models, have brought a lot of that topic to our attention. And I first just want to review the potential that AI could have for education. And it will, of course, not be complete. So we have the AI here, we have the teacher, and we have the student. And ideally, the AI could support both the teacher and the student. So for example, the AI could generate content for the teacher. So lecture material, exercises, assignments, and so on. Could help the teacher grade the students. Or it could, something a bit more specific, support a teacher in their classroom orchestration by observing or analyzing in detail the behaviors of the student and then give back information or recommendations to the teacher. Of course, we could also use the AI on the student side, so this side of me, mainly to personalize the learning experience. So we could provide feedback that is targeted to the student, or hints that are targeted, or we could address misconceptions, or we could use AI to generate examples or tasks for the students which are optimal for their learning. So these are, of course, just a few examples on both sides. I'm sure you can think of more uses on how we could use AI. And what I want to focus on today, so I will remove these two, because what I want to focus on today is on individualization and personalization. So how can we provide a personalized learning experience by supporting the students and at the same time the teacher? So in order to reach such individualization, we basically need to solve problems in two areas. So that's a bit simplified, but I grouped it in two main areas. So the first area that I will talk about more today is the machine learning or AI. So we need to have models that can represent the knowledge of the student, their learning, their behavior, their strategies, whatever in the system, and then they can make predictions about the student, and based on these predictions, we can provide now, in the second area, instruction that is personalized or for the student, or we can support the teacher in orchestrating and organizing their classroom. So why did I put the second area? While I will focus mainly today on the first area, the second area is extremely important. So even if we have had the first area figured out, so we have solved it, we have the perfect models, these models, of course, don't just live in the void or out of context, but these models are basically tools that will be used, and they are only as good as the context they are used in. So the second area, which is more on human-computer interaction and education and pedagogy, is extremely important, because we need to make sure that when we have our models, that they are aligned to, let's say, the context. So the learning domain, for example, what do we teach? Is it math? Is it languages? Is it some type of strategies? Are we teaching university students, or are we teaching elementary students? Because we might interact very differently with students of different ages. Are our interactions aligned to what we know is good for learning? And another example, are they even useful for real-world classrooms, or are our tools aligned to the needs of real-world classrooms? So there's, to bring AI for education to practice, we don't only need the AI, but we will also need the human-computer interaction and the education. Nevertheless, today, I just wanted to make this point to emphasize that the tool does not make the teaching. Nevertheless, today, I will talk mainly about the tool and the research we do at my lab, which mainly focuses on this first part, on modeling the knowledge, the strategies, and the behavior of the students. So what are the challenges there? So why is this difficult, or why is the education domain difficult? The education domain, it's difficult because it does not adhere to the assumptions that state-of-the-art machine learning makes. So for example, usually in education we have pretty small data sets. We don't have observations of millions of students that we can analyze, but we might have 200 to 300 students, and our models need to work for 200 to 300 students also. We might have very specific data sets, so we might have people solving math problems, or we might have people learning languages, or we might even have, as you will see, students interacting with simulations and changing parameters in a simulation, so our data might be very specific to the environment, making it hard to transfer or generalize features or models. And then we have two additional requirements beyond accuracy. So one requirement is interpretability. So if our model is just accurate, but we don't really understand why we make a prediction, then it's going to be really hard, because it's going to be really hard to make a meaningful action based on the prediction. And it's also going to be really hard for the trust of the students and teachers if we cannot explain what we predict. And then the last one is, of course, fairness. If our models are used in real life, in schools, or in university, we need to make sure that we are fair to all subpopulations. So what I will focus on today is two aspects. One is the aspect of generalizability, so methods that can generalize across tasks or domain, and always with a limited amount of data, and methods that are interpretable. And here I will interpret, or here I will see generalizability in a quite a broad way, because my lab is working on generalizability from very different aspects. So let me show you some of these different aspects and then some examples on how we solve them. So here in the gray you will see what we want to generalize. So we want to basically generalize between different tasks. So in this case, we have a massive open online course from EPFL, and we want to make different predictions about the students such that we can support them optimally. So for example, we want to predict how well they will do in the next week. Or we want to predict, will they drop the course next week? Or we might also want to make some long-term predictions, like, will they get a certificate in the end? And what we have done in this work is that we have built a modular network that can, in a single model, decode at the same time to all these different prediction tasks. So that's one way. Here we generalize one model for different tasks. Another type of generalization that we are interested in is generalization across different domains. We are still here in the example of massive open online courses. So we have a huge MOOC platform, and here we want to transfer a model from one course to another course, or to several other courses. And I will talk about this project in detail just after the overview. The third project regarding generalizability is very similar in a way to the second one, but here we again want to generalize between different domains, physics and chemistry, but we also have environments where the data is a bit specific and different, so we cannot directly compare the data, and here we are not interested in generalizing the whole model, but in using similar feature representations. And I will also talk about this project in more detail. And then the final aspect that we have looked at, it's again generalizing features, so generalizing feature representations across different domains, different environments, and what I did not put here is different populations. So in this project, what we have done is we have designed features that analyze student self-regulated learning along with a pipeline for clustering them over time, which allows us to analyze student behavior in very different settings. And we have done that for chef apprentices writing recipes. We have done that for EPFL students in flipped classrooms, and we have done that for high school students learning math and German. So what I will present you now a bit in more detail, try to not go into too much detail, are these two projects where I will first show how we can transfer across MOOC courses and then how we can find more general feature representations in interactive simulations. Now So the first example, the question is, how can we identify whether a student is struggling early on while they are taking an online course? So we want to find a model that will predict us whether someone will finish and pass the course or not, and ideally, of course, not at the end of the course, but maybe 4 or 5 weeks in. Usually here we will work with about half the course passed. So how do we do that? So basically, we take features about their behavior. These are features that are agnostic to the domain. These are features like how regular do they work each week? How much effort do they spend? How consistent are they over time? Are they ahead or behind the schedule? We feed them into a recurrent neural network and then we make a prediction of whether the student struggles or not. So now the problem, of course, is when I'm teaching a course and I'm 5 weeks in, I cannot really train on the data of my course because my students have not yet taken the final exam, so I don't have a ground truth label, which means that I need to train the model on past courses. A very naive approach is I just train it on any past course that I have available and use it to predict on my data. So, of course, not unexpectedly, this doesn't work extremely well. So here, that's the balanced accuracy, and 0.5 would be random. So we are better than random, but it doesn't work really well. So then another idea is, oh, maybe if the data is more similar, that will help me. So maybe I have taught the course in the past years. So what I will do is I will just train on my past data and then use the model to predict on the actual course. Yeah, works much better, but sometimes I don't have past data. So what do I do when I don't have any data of my topic or my course available? So what we tried in the next step is we train a big model. So we take the data of all courses that we have available, we train the model on all these courses, and of course we expect this to generalize better because these courses are all very different and have very different populations. So big model trained on all the courses but my course, and then prediction happening on the course that I'm teaching right now. So this works better, of course, for the case where we didn't have any data, but sometimes work better than training on previous iterations and sometimes not. And of course, in advance, we don't know why. So can we find an approach that can outperform both of these such that we are sure which model to use when we want to make live predictions? So the next idea that we tried is to add meta information to the model. And so I realized on the next slide, I think the illustration is a bit complex, but I will just explain the very sub part of it. So basically the idea is we still take the behavior, the features that we had, how regular people work, but then we add to the model information about the course. So what is the title of the course? What is the description? What level is it? Is it master, bachelor? What language is it taught in? And so on. And then basically we just concatenate this and make a final prediction using a neural network. So what you need to remember from this is adding meta information. So the idea is that we have a big data set of courses, and we have a course that we want to predict on, and we would assume that we want to bias, it would be good to bias our big model or classifier towards a bit courses that are similar to the course that we want to predict on. So we would think maybe if the courses that are also on master students or on a similar topic, the students might behave more similarly, so we would benefit more from training on these courses. So we add these features to the model in order to improve the prediction. And then, that should be the pink one. So that's just 3 examples. We have more examples, of course, but we can see that it's always at least as good as training on previous iterations. And sometimes, if the previous iterations of a course are not so similar, or sometimes there were iterations where a lot of students failed, it's better to train on all the data that you have and bias your classifier towards using meta information. So that was just one example of showing transfer, and now we will also transfer to a very different domain, but to kind of a similar task. So the second example is in a very different domain and population. So this has an application, and these are laboratory technicians, apprentices, that are solving these types of tasks. So basically, they need to learn about chemistry and physics. And the idea is not to just teach them the equations, but to let them figure out the equations on their own using a simulation. Basically, what they do is they interact with the simulation, try to figure out relationship between variables, and after 10, 15 minutes, they will need to predict how these flasks here should be ranked. That is not so easy, because you cannot just copy and do it in the simulation, but in the simulation, you figure out relationships and equations and use then the model that you produced to make predictions. Same thing for this capacitor lab. So a lot of students struggle with this, and we want to help them, and we want to especially identify who are the students that struggle. So again, first try is we do kind of an action count of different types of actions that they did in the simulations to be added up and flatten and use a random forest model and just try to predict who will be successful. Works great for one environment, doesn't work at all for the other environment, or not at all, but just much less good. So that's the area under the curve, and 0.5 would again be random. So the question now is, in one environment it seems to be enough to use engineered flattened features, but maybe in the other environment we need more information. So of course, when the students that use the simulation interact with the simulation, they are kind of generating a time series of actions. So the simulation is in a certain state. They perform an action that influences the state. Simulation is a new state, they perform an action, and this happens over time. So shouldn't we use a model that can actually handle time series data? And that is what we did next. So we used a recurrent neural network. So basically, we always have an input here, and we have a state, and then at the time step the input comes in, we compute the state. Then we go to the next time step, and from the input and the state in the previous time step, we can compute our new state, and at the end, again, we predict, will the student be successful or not? And now, of course, we can make our input very much closer to how the actual student clickstream data looks like. The actual features, I think they don't look like this, but this is just an example. So we have a state, we have a vector encoding the state, like the wavelength is, well, I cannot read it, 508, guess. The solution is red, and so on. And then a one-hot encoding about the action that the student performed. We have a time series of this, and now we again just predict. And what happens, so the yellow and the green are variations of GRU models. Not much improvement here, but that's expected because we were already so good before. And substantial improvement for the second lab. So now we replace the random forest model with the action counts with a more complex model where we are more close to the raw data and we are more accurate. That's great, but we have also lost something. So now any guess, suggestions from the audience, what have we lost? Explainability, yes, exactly. Thanks, I'm glad that. didn't want my lab to answer, yes, we have lost explainability. Because now we have all these states and actions, and we make a prediction, and we don't really know why we make this prediction. So luckily, what we had done, we have some option to interpret a bit, because here we had a GRU, and here we had a GRU architecture including so-called self-attention weights after the input layer. And what we did is we went over multiple runs with different seeds, and we can try to interpret the self-attention weights. So the top 4 are the state, the rest are the actions, and since we are familiar with the data, we can get some interpretation out of it, so we can see that the model pays a lot of attention to the state, and the model pays a lot of attention to green, 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 red, which are the laser color and the solution. And what I learned about chemistry over the past 4 years is that if you have a green laser color and a green solution, your absorbance will almost be 0, so you will not observe anything in the experimentation. So it tells us something about the experimental conditions the students are in. However, as you see, this interpretation is extremely coarse, not easy to make, and I don't know how I would communicate this to teachers or students in a great way. And this leads me to the second topic, which is, okay, now we use deep learning models, we have better accuracy, but we lost all interpretability. So what can we do about this? And so I will again first give a more or less coarse taxonomy on how we can explain. And by far the most popular way of explaining is so-called post-hoc explainability. So we take the neural network model, we make a prediction, and after we have the prediction, we try to interpret the prediction. We can, for example, do this by doing small perturbations to example samples and then fitting an interpretable model like a regression and decision tree and interpret these weights. I will show an example of this or the problems of this later. So that's post-hoc. So we keep the model a black box and we explain it later. Another idea would be to use inherently interpretable models. So inherently interpretable models are like traditional models like regression or decision trees where we can see why they predicted something. But we can also make more complex neural networks models interpretable by adjusting their architecture. What I have just shown you before is some kind of something for me in between. We used some self-attention weights, or we try to interpret the embeddings, but which you have seen is not the most useful part. So what I will now quickly show is post-hoc and inherent interpretability, just examples. So we used post-hoc explainability on our famous now MOOC case where we have students and we want to predict whether they will fail the course or whether they will pass the course. So what we took is we took 5 courses and then we fit the model for each course over some students. We took 1, 2, 3, it's 5 famous post-hoc explainability methods, and what we found is that when we look at their feature importance score, they do not, as expected, cluster by the course, because we would assume that you get the same explanations for the same student in the same course, but by the method. So which means that all these post-hoc explainers systematically disagree, and it's more important what method you use than what data you have. So we said, okay, that's an issue. What should we use now to explain our models? And we said, okay, let's be smart. We don't have ground truth, but maybe human teachers, they know. We can just, instead of checking which model is correct, explanation is correct, we check which model human teachers prefer. And so we conducted interviews with 26 STEM professors and asked them, so we showed them explanations of 3 methods without revealing what it was, and we showed them and let them choose which one they prefer and why. So what do you think came out of this? Yes?
We also disagree.
Did you get input? Yes. Not surprisingly, the human teachers also disagreed. So basically, what we saw in the human teachers, and like in retrospect, that's not surprising, they all, or the human professors, so it was all STEM professors across the world, there's a very diverse prior belief on what makes a student successful and what makes a student fail. And then based on the prior belief they had, they would, of course, prefer the method that aligned most with their prior belief. And only 3 people out of 26 in different comparisons always chose the same method as preferred. So what do we learn? First, we cannot get any ground truth of human teachers. Or it is too difficult, or maybe we can say it's too difficult for them to decide, because they will also disagree and there's different opinions. So if we cannot get ground truth, in this case from post hoc explainability, maybe we should just make models that we can interpret inherently and we know why we made a prediction. And that's the last use case I want to show you. I see. Again, on MOOCs, but now a bit a different use case where you are a user, you go to a MOOC platform, and the question is, what course should you take next? Of course, we can give you recommendations as you get them, for example, maybe on Netflix, where you say, most popular today or most popular movie, but maybe we would want to make a recommendation that is a bit more founded. And so we propose to do this using so-called knowledge graphs. So you have a learner. The learner can take a course in green. The course is taught by an instructor. That would be orange. And then the course is about a certain topic. And of course, now the recommendation that we make amounts to finding a path on this graph from a learner to a course that we want to recommend. So how we do that? This is kind of a sequential decision-making process, and we will use reinforcement learning to model this. So that's our agent. Our agent has to make a decision. So now it chooses the first course and not the lower one. Then it again has to decide where to go on the graph, chooses to go to the topic, and then here we constrain the agent to not do more than 3 hops. So in the 3rd hop, it will land in a course. So how does this work? Basically, very simple. The agent gets a reward if it lands on a course that is actually in our training set, and it gets punished if it lands not on a course in the training set or somewhere else. So this method is very accurate, so it outperforms previous methods on course recommendations, but also on movie recommendations or Amazon data sets. And it is, at least in terms of interpretability, on par with traditional method explanations such as collaborative filtering. We have done a very small user study, so that's just a glimpse of this, where we showed a path, a popularity, and collaborative filtering. This would be other learners also who took similar courses also took this. And we see that people generally like the path-based explanations and they can understand it. So this was my last example on generalizability and interpretability. And so the question is, what is next? So what we have seen is, okay, we have specific domains. Models might be constrained, or they might be generalizable but not interpretable. So the next step, or what we are currently working on at the lab, is combining this type of deep learning or traditional models with large language models. So large language models that have just come up, they are of course not restricted to a specific domain, and they allow very natural interactions which would solve our communication problem. However, they might not be correct. They do not keep a history of the user. So if I come on one day and then on the next day, they might not say, oh, yesterday Tanja did this specific mistake and she must have a misconception, and they might not be pedagogically so meaningful. But we believe that if we combine the two approaches, so if we combine language models and domain-specific knowledge, we could actually get the best out of both worlds. And so what I would like to finish with, because I just talked about this side, and Rüdiger told everyone that we're doing things applied and in practice. So maybe I should show something from practice. And this is a tool that I like very much, and it's recipe learning through examples. So it was done for chef apprentices who need to learn to document their recipes. And what you can do is you write any recipes on the left in the text editor. And then what happens is you will get a personalized example on the right side. So how this is done, and the personalized example will be annotated with all kinds of tips of things that you are missing in your recipe. So how this is done is that a large language model takes your recipe and makes a quality prediction. The model was trained on an existing recipe database with ratings. And then this is combined with an algorithm that takes domain-specific rules and annotates the recipes. So we will retrieve a recipe for you that has a better quality prediction than you, and that fulfills more rules than you do, and that is even similar to your recipe in the database. And finally here, here we added some reflection questions, because we know that if you show people examples, you should make them reflect over them. And so that was a very short example. I think the tool should be up, so if any one of you likes cooking and writing recipes, feel free to try it out. And so with this, I would like to conclude, and I have the same picture. I would like to give a special thank to all my lab members. Without them, this research would not have been possible, and I feel really happy that I can work with so passionate and smart students and postdocs.